We are live now. Please start.
Good morning, everyone. It's truly a pleasure and a privilege for me to uh, host this webinar today with one of India's and probably Asia's most eminent climate scientist, Mridula Ramesh. She's also a good friend and a scientist who I turn to every time I need light to shine on this truly dark topic of climate change, but a topic that we need a lot of focus on. If I could quickly introduce Mridula to those of you who are not familiar with her work, she is an award-winning author of two truly spectacular books that I would encourage you to read, The Climate Solution and Watershed. She is also the founder of an exceptional institute that does great work in climate, Sundaram Climate Institute. It focuses on waste and water solutions, just came up with a great seminal report on waste. She's a very active climate tech angel investor, in fact, has invested in over 30 startups and has done a truly spectacular job in spurring climate tech entrepreneurship. She graduated from Cornell University with distinction and then did her MBA from Kellogg School of Management and has worked in Silicon Valley with McKinsey and has helped run Sundaram Textiles, which was amongst the first textile companies in the world to win the coveted TPM Excellence Award. She's a part of the board of trustees of World Wildlife Fund in India and is the former chairperson of NIT Andhra Pradesh. She's a very prolific columnist with Hindustan Times and Times of India, and she lives in Madurai in a nearly net zero house, which I've had the pleasure of visiting and seeing how she runs the place with her home and two lovely children. Mridula, such a pleasure to have you here today, and over to you.
Thank you, Amit, for that very, very kind introduction. And Amit is a very good friend and also does tremendous work on water, as we shall see later. Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be speaking with you today. I'm going to begin our session with asking you a question. What were you doing in late February of 2020? I was in Delhi. I had just finished presenting to the expert committee on water policy, and I'd gone to the airport to take a flight to Chennai. Nobody was wearing masks. And there was some talk about, the Wuhan being shut down because of some virus and that there was an outbreak in Italy. It seemed also very far away, happening to someone else. I want you to keep that in mind. And let's now turn to the main topic of today and ask, what is climate change? For that, I'm going to share a video. This is from NASA. And what it shows is the temperature change from a baseline over the last 140-50 years. And blue means it got colder from the baseline. Yellow means it's about the same. And orange and red means it's got hotter. Okay, so it's a very short video. So this is 1900s. This is the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and today. Right? And if anything, it's gotten a little warmer since then. This video ends at about 2017. All in all, the world is warmed by about 1 degree. And many of you may be thinking, look, a degree is not a lot. But there's a popular saying that says, if climate change is a shark, then water is its teeth. And how does climate change affects water in 3 ways, right? Because warmer air holds more water. That's a basic law of physics. And that makes climate change affect the world's water cycle in 3 steps. So first, it rains on fewer days, right? And second, we get more rainfall from intense days. And third, climate change increased water contrast. It makes wet regions wetter. it makes dry regions drier, it makes wet seasons wetter, and it makes dry seasons drier. Let me try and see if we can make this clearer with an example. So let's take Bangalore, right? Bangalore gets about, I think, 840 millimeters in about 50 to 60 days. But what happened in the last year? So if you look at this chart, right, between September and December, basically the retreating monsoon, which Bangalore gets a substantial amount of rainfall from, on just 4 days, Bangalore got 150 millimeters of rain. That's a lot. So clearly it flooded after that. And then for months on end, it didn't rain at all. So you had this water crisis. So, you had these very posh houses getting flooded during the rains. And, in the summer, you had millionaires going to malls to do their morning ablutions. And to blame climate change alone is not fair, because it takes two hands to clap. And what we've done is we've built over every city surface substantially over the last few decades. So we've built over our water bodies. I think the built up area was about less than 10% in the early 70s. And today it's, I think, over 85% today. So what happens if intense rainfall falls? It has no way to percolate into the ground. And now it just rushes off and floods. And because it hasn't percolated into the ground, there's no groundwater. So come the summer after months of no rain, you get drought, right? So when you put this all together, this is happening not just in Bangalore, but across the length and breadth of our country. You get this. You get the rising incidence of floods, storms, and droughts, right? So this is 1900s, and this is today. You get a rising incidence, and then you get a rising incidence of the number affected by floods, storms, and droughts. Now, many of you have taken heroic efforts, not just to predict disasters, but to take early action so that people can be saved. So the death toll from these kind of disasters, water-related disasters, has come down substantially. But because India has gotten wealthier, the damage toll has increased. And this, I don't know whether you can see this, because I think this is blocking it. But this is the 2020s. In just 4 years, we're already meeting the damage toll of the entire 2010s, right? So if you look at the last 10 years, India has lost about $9.3 billion a year from water-related disasters. That's about the same as the budget for the Department of Drinking Water and Sanitation, which houses the Jal Jeevan Mission. It's a big deal. So why did I ask you about COVID in the beginning? Because everything you've seen till now is the past, right? And where we are in the climate change crisis is in the February 2020 of the COVID crisis. So in February 2020, you thought it was something happening far away to someone else. But within a month, India had shut down, the world had shut down. And then you got the first wave. I lost family then there was fear, then vaccine development, then the Delta wave. And COVID really left the world changed. And where we are today in the climate change crisis is in the February 2020 of the COVID crisis. So that has to do with a phenomenon called climate inertia. It's just the way the carbon system works. And that means even if you start cutting down emissions, even if you stop emissions, the world will continue to warm. And many of these effects, intense rainfall, fewer rain days, increasing climate contrast will all start getting worse. Which is why today I've chosen to speak about climate adaptation. And when you talk about climate adaptation, the worst is yet to come. So and water takes center stage. How will India get affected by climate change? So let's take agriculture. Yields are expected to fall in the next few decades if we don't adapt because of a combination of rising heat, uneven rainfall, and pest attacks. But what I want to share with you next is this chart. Okay. So again, let me just move this. This chart is onion prices over the last 30 years. And it really is talking about water because onion farmers are broadly rain-fed, right? Onion farms are broadly rain-fed. So the increasing volatility that you see here in the past 10 years is talking about the increased volatility of our rain. And what it's begging us to do is to manage our water better. And the same thing is happening in our cities also, right? There is this, because we have not managed our water as well as we could, we get this alternating pattern of drought and flood. But is that the story? Climate change makes life worse and that's it? No, of course not. If it was so, the speech would end here. Like in COVID, there is a vaccine that we have. There is a vaccine we can develop. But to get to that vaccine, we need to understand why we got to crisis point. Right? Today, water is invisible. That's the biggest problem. You don't think about it until it becomes a problem. And I'm going to do a very quick experiment, guys. I don't know whether you can see this. I'm going to take a glass of water. I'm going to carefully measure out half a drop, drink it, and then leave the rest of it away. That half a drop is all the water that exists underground, in rivers, lakes, swamps, in the air, in nature, in us. Okay, if the glass of water is the Earth's water, that half a drop is all we have access to. And India's situation is worse because we ask a fifth of the world's population to survive on 1/30th of the world's water resources. But because we drink water all the time or we go to the bathroom every day, we think, because water is all around us, we think we've forgotten how precious it is, right? I forgot 12 years ago until water was invisible to me, until I ran out of it at home. And then as it made itself visible by its absence, we learned how to understand it and then manage it and then build climate resilience. And so much so that, when Madurai went through its worst drought in over a century, we were the only house in the neighborhood not to buy water. And the lessons I learned are what I'm going to share with you today. But to understand, where we always like this, I'm going to, for the next 20 minutes, we're going to go through a history lesson. And we're going to cover about 5,000 years of history in about the next 15 to 20 minutes. Okay? So let's just get started. So what you see, we're going to start our story in the Indus Valley civilization in northwest of the Indian subcontinent. And we're going to go to Mohenjo-daro. So, we all know that, look, Indus Valley is characterized by drains. They have these standard bricks. But that really hides the sheer diversity of how marvelous the cities adapted to their water. So Mohenjo-daro here lies next to the Indus. Right? So it had a lot of water, so it could afford things like the Great Bath and all that. But what you see in the bottom is Dholavira. And Dholavira had access to very little rain, comparatively speaking. So its entire design was on storage. So a series of water reservoirs that it used to store water. But what is really, really fascinating is the kind of what the Indus Valley farmers grew. And I'm going to turn to the results from a Cambridge University study. These scientists took thousands of seeds across the length of and breadth of the Indus Valley civilization. And they dated it and they found out what these farmers grew. And the Indus Valley farmers understood their water. So what they grew in Harappa, which had far more water, is things like rice and melons. But what they grew in a small village in Gujarat, which didn't have that much rain, is millets. And over time, they changed what they grew. These seeds were dated over 1,000 years, from 3,500 BC to 2,500 BC. And they changed what they grew based on the rains and how the rains changed. And that's very, very important. Because one thing we all seem to forget is water is not water. India's water is very special because of 4 reasons. The first is it has widely varying rainfall by geography. So this is a photograph I took when I was visiting Rajasthan, and places like this get about 165 millimeters of rainfall. And on here, you see something from northeastern India, which get meters of rainfall in a matter of months. And what you grow here and how you build here has to vary by the change in rainfall. The second aspect, and this chart is from WRI, it shows how seasonal a country's rainfall is. And you can see here that India has probably one of the most seasonally variable rainfall of all the world. And what that really means is that you need, because you use water every day, you have to manage the seasonal supply with this daily demand. And to make matters worse, India has highly temporally skewed rainfall. And what do I mean by that? So this is a picture of Amsterdam, this is a picture of Delhi. And they both surprisingly get the same amount of rainfall, about 800 millimeters a year. But Amsterdam gets this over 180 days, but Delhi gets it in, between 45 to 50 days, and most of it in a handful of days. You remember that Bangalore spike? Same in Delhi. And what that means is, in Delhi, if you don't focus on storage, the same amount of rainfall, Delhi is much more likely to flood, right, on those intense flood days. And same way, if that flood water runs away in the summer, Delhi is much more likely to suffer water shortage. So lastly, we are going to see how Indian rainfall varies over the last, century or so. So in a sense, using a concept like average annual rainfall is a very dangerous concept in India. It's like a general asks, how is the war going? Okay, and a soldier comes back and tells him, well, on average, everybody's somewhat dead. That doesn't help you at all. So, but the Indus Valley farmers really adapted to this, right? They changed what they grew. I mean, the study actually found they switched from wheat to barley, depending on whether the rainfall for a particular period was good or bad. But in cities today, what we do is we very often plan water supply on average rainfall. So this is a result from my study, my institute study. So we've spoken to about 2,000 plus people over 6 years, asking them a series of questions on their waste and water reality. And when we asked them about how often do you get water, municipal water, we found in an El Nino year, okay, which is a lower rainfall year, about half the household got irregular water, which means regular is they get water daily or every other day. But irregular means they get water less often than that. So it's always these El Nino years, but El Nino years come every 2 to 7 years. And if we don't plan for it, like the Indus Valley farmers did, we're going to run into problems. But let's get back to our history lesson. Right? And now we're going to move forward and we're going to go to the time of Chanakya. Now, Chanakya's water philosophy was really interesting. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep it short. All water belonged to the king, Chanakya said. And because he knew that centralized ownership made governance that much easier. Interestingly, Israel and Singapore, two poster children of water management, follow that philosophy. But India has millions of borewells across the length and breadth of its country, so we can't operationalize this kind of centralized ownership. And what is really, really interesting, and this is something I'd really like you to pay attention to, is Chanakya's water pricing. So everybody paid a price for water in Chanakya's time, but many paid for it through a share of labor. And that automatically avoids wastage. Because if you spend time hauling water, or your family member has spent time hauling water from a well, you're unlikely to waste it for most people. But what is really interesting is, in agriculture, people paid a share of crop as their water tax. And what that means is it works with India's water. It works with the seasonality and the interannual variation. Because if there is a year with poor rainfall, a farmer would just pay a share of crop. And because the crop was smaller, his absolute taxes were lower. During a bumper year, he'd pay a share of crop. Because the crop was bigger, the share of absolute tax was higher. But what is really interesting is, farmers who took water from an irrigation source using some form of technology, whether it was a bullock cart or some other, like a wheel or something, they paid a higher share of tax than a poorer farmer. So Chanakya kept inequality front and center in his water tax. Sorry. And then he also rewards maintenance by giving tax breaks for people who maintain engineering. And so let me turn to the engineering of that time, right? The engineering of that time, and this is something that Amit's organization also works extensively on, is tanks. So a tank in an area is usually the lowest point of an area, and you build a bund and it gathers the rainwater, right? But what is really interesting, and here you see a satellite image from Bhuvan in Madurai, and you see these are the system tanks. And what they do is through the river and through the canals, these get water, and as each fills, the downstream tanks start getting filled. And Amit, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to get into a financial analogy. System tanks are a bit like FDI, right? So they take during the monsoon, Indian rivers swell, right? Because upstream regions get a lot of rain. And that excess rainfall comes through the river. There's a check dam, gets diverted into the canals, and then they start filling up the tanks. So you've taken care of seasonality, you've taken care of geographical variability, because a high rainfall region is now giving rain to a low rainfall region. This is very much like FDI, where surplus savings from another country come and energize the local economy. And I don't have time, but it also takes care of temporal skew, because when there's intense rainfall, the tank gives you a place to hold that intense rainfall, and it also takes care of interannual variation. And tanks in ancient times, and even in many places in India today, are supported by financial and non-financial incentives. For incentive, just 1 second. So the financial incentives were people who got access to irrigation. That irrigation came with responsibilities for tank maintenance, clearing out encroachments, maintaining bunds, desilting, all of that. Others got cash flow from the fishing that the tank maintained. When we were talking to doing our rural tank study, we found that the varieties of fish in those ancient tanks varied with the water levels. But we won't go into that now. They got water to maintain livestock. They even got cash from selling lotuses that grew in the pond. But equally important were the non-financial incentives. Right? Many functional tanks were the center of village festivities. So, these non-financial status that you got from maintaining tanks were very important. It's sort of like belonging to a very prestigious club today. You'll go to great lengths to get that membership and keep it. Many told us burial and cremation rites also came from that. And what all this did is it kept the community link very, very strong. And, in our study, when we saw even small tanks, when the community link was strong, in crowded neighborhoods, it was pristine. Whereas if the community link was broken, even large tanks in, non-crowded neighborhoods, they were empty. So that connect is very important, and we'll see how to maintain it a little later. And a functional tank is really, really important. This is a study we did by crowdsourcing groundwater levels. We've studied about 100 tanks or so. And then when we crowdsourced groundwater levels around a tank, we got this kind of a chart which said a functional tank or a water body kept groundwater levels about 200 feet higher than it otherwise would have been. And that 200 feet is pure gold in a drought. So, for a very long time, India understood its water, respected it, and managed it. And that made India wealthy. Wealth, of course, gathers others also who want to share in that wealth. And now in our history lesson, we move to the mid-19th century and we go to Punjab. So when the British settled Punjab, the biggest change they brought about was changing from the payable in kind of a tax to a payable in cash kind of a tax. Okay, and this was based not on the actual output of the land, but on what settlement officers in a very brief time said was the assessed productive capacity of a land. So I'm actually going to quote from one of these settlement officers, a guy called Septimus Thauber, and he calls it a grave error, which required a farmer who'd never handled coin in his life before to pay his government twice a year a fixed sum of money, crop or no crop. So this brought in, and this imposing this kind of a fixed cash tax regime in India's variable and volatile water was courting disaster. And it did court disaster, as we shall as we shall see shortly, right? But now the farmer had to borrow during a drought to pay that tax, right? So that's where this debt trap that many farmers suffer from even today started. Made another very profound change. Now farmers wanted to grow crops that they could sell for cash. Indigo, cotton, wheat, all of which had an export market, right? So they moved from the millet, which was suited to India's water, to these crops. The second big change that the British brought was they cut down forests. Punjab had forests, right? And they cut down, even in Punjab, they cut down thousands of trees for wood for their sleeper tracks. And in UP, between the Ganga and the Yamuna, there was forests act like AC because they evaporate so much water, they cool the area around them. And they cut down so many trees that it got warmer. And one person writes that, in 1854, in the British barracks, pankas, a kind of ancient fans, had to be introduced for the first time because it had gotten so much warmer because of deforestation. But, the link, many of us think of forests because of the carbon they store. But the forest and water story is far more interesting. Right? So let me start with three things. I won't go into more detail than that. In hilly regions, when there's intense rainfall, the roots of the trees act like scaffolding to hold back the soil. Second, forests smooth out the seasonality. Intense rainfall is slowed by the canopy, right? And then it goes into the ground. The humus slows it down further, purifies it, and the forest slowly releases the stream in the dry season. One study actually compared dry season flow coming out of natural forests and degraded forests. And they found that dry season or summer flow coming out of natural forests were 40% higher than degraded forests. So what happens when we clear those forests? Why not? When you have deforestation, you get landslides, right? This is Madurai. This is the dry Vaigai and people standing next to it buying water from a tanker. So when cities don't have enough summer water, please look upstream and see how much of their upstream forests have gotten destroyed. I could spend the whole day talking about this, but in the interest of time, I want to move on. Right? So as forests were cleared, people were blocked from entering forests. More and more farmers started growing crops that were not suited to their water regimes. When India's rains fell, as they did periodically, India got into famine. Between 1875 and 1907, between 18 to 27 million, and this is a conservative estimate, 18 to 27 million Indians died. Many of our independence fighters were forged by this experience. And this chapter of our history doesn't receive the kind of attention it ought to have. And I wonder whether if we do pay more attention to these famines and what happened there, whether we would respect our water more. But the most destabilizing philosophy that the British left us is that technology can solve any problem. And don't get me wrong, right? I'm not against technology. I'm what they call a techno-optimist, right? I actually invest in technologies that help us with climate change. But I think the technology should understand the problem that it's trying to solve. But we took that philosophy forward. And in the aftermath of another famine in the mid-60s, when the Americans this time held India ship to mouth, as someone put it. So they said, we'll give you the wheat, but you have to do what we say. The Indian leadership said, look, we have to become food secure. And that's when the Green Revolution started, when we started growing seeds that could grow fat fast when given enough water and fertilizer. And the driving engine of the Green Revolution was the borewell, right? And look, put yourself in 1967. You just started tapping that underground ocean. It seemed vast. It seemed endless. Maybe that's why we grew a crop that requires 1,200 millimeters of rain in a land that gets between 500 to 700 millimeters of rain. And the crop I'm talking about is rice, and the land that I'm talking about is Northwest India. And but we did, and in 1967, rice occupied 7% of the crop area in Punjab. Today it's ubiquitous. But the farmers responded, right? When they got the bore well, they got the fertilizer, they got the support. People started buying, the FCI started buying the grain, and they responded, and they really grew, and they were heroes. And in few short decades, we went from importing millions of tons of rice and wheat to becoming food surplus. But if there's one thing I've learned in life, there is no such thing as a free lunch, right? And this tremendous accomplishment, okay, and let's not diminish this accomplishment. This tremendous accomplishment came at the price of water. If you just consider, the water embedded in the rice and wheat that Punjab and Haryana sold to FCI in 2018, just that water, it's in 1 year, okay, 2018, it's enough water to provide drinking water to Delhi, Mumbai, Bengaluru, Hyderabad, Kolkata, Chennai for 13 years. It's an ocean of water in just, that small 1 year fraction. And naturally, that took a toll on the groundwater of those regions. And the groundwater fell. So I'm going to quote from a 60-year-old farmer in Sangrur who spoke to the Hindu. And he said, look, in 1977, we got our first bore well. At that time, water was easily available at 15 to 20 feet. Since then, we've drilled as many as 4 bore wells, right? And the water levels have been consistently falling. I got the latest one installed 2 years ago at 300 feet. It cost me 1 lakh rupees. In this context of falling water, let's come back to climate change, right? Rice yields are expected to, they've started plateauing, they're expected to fall. Wheat yields are already fallen somewhat and they're expected to fall further. There is one study that said, look, wheat doesn't like heat in March, and that's going to become increasingly common in climate change. And yields could fall between 15 to 20% in the next, between now and the next 20 years. But you can do something about it, right? So what could farmers do? They could water the wheat more frequently, which is going to be difficult given the falling groundwater levels. Or they could plant the wheat a little earlier. Now, do you see the problem with that? When you plant the wheat a little earlier, you reduce the already small gap between the rice harvest and the yield, wheat planting. So if you're reducing the the gap further, the propensity to light the fields on fire goes up. Look, I think we owe our farmers, they've made us food secure, and that's a very, very important thing. But when our bread baskets sit on a very shaky water foundation, and when climate change is shaking that foundation, it's questioning the Atmanirbhar of food security in India. And that's not a good thing in geopolitically interesting times. So that's a question I'll leave with you. And now let me go back to the history lesson and go to our cities. Look, post-independence, millions were flowing into Indian cities. And because Indian cities are so land scarce, more so than other cities in other countries, they needed a place to live, place to, facilities to be provided. And where would that land come from? From tax. Again, let's go back to the British. If you read a lot of the British health inspector reports, they called tanks very unhealthy, which bred cholera and malaria and all that. So this is a picture of Long Tank in Chennai. It was 2 miles wide and 3 miles long, and the Chennai Boat Club actually held their winter races there. It was that big. Today, many of you may know of it as T Nagar, which is one of the most busy neighborhoods in Chennai. But as tanks disappeared across the length and breadth of our country, the water resilience of cities fell because tanks, by definition, are built to gather rainfall. So when you have intense rainfall and you've built a house where a tank is supposed to be, it will flood. And without the tank to recharge groundwater, as you saw, it will you get into this problem in the summer, as Bangaloreans living in peripheral areas will tell you. Is that the story? I mean, and when Chennai and Bangalore hit the headlines for being flooded or drought, when we look at supply chains realigning, you see here of this China plus one, etc. Ask yourself how many people would want to set up a factory or a GCC in a place that's always flooding and or suffering from a water crisis. This is something that is fixable, and this is something we can fix and must. So let me now come back to the COVID story again, right? What can we do? What is the vaccine we can develop to handle this crisis? If there's one thing I want you to take away from this lecture, it is we need to store water, right? But I don't want to give you theoretical explanations, right? We have to recognize we are a raucous democracy, and any policy needs to be implementable. So please keep your eye on cash flow and jobs that your policy will create. So let me go into three kinds of solutions in the interest of time. I think we're okay. So I'll just quickly go through this. See, for me to tell you like price water is the most elegant thing to do. That's what Chanakya would have advised. But we went and asked people in Madurai, like, would you pay for water? Many of them said no. So there is this need for education. Like, guys, you're paying more already. And this is, I've talked about case studies in the book. Some of you can afford to do that, some of you can't. And some of you who can should, because one of the big benefits of India is its size. So, one of our cities is bigger than Israel. So even if you can implement it in one city through education campaign, etc., make it progressive, offer a lot of people a basic quantity of free water, etc. You can spur the kind of innovation. And I've looked at, some of these very energetic people, go-getting people who have solved problems. What we need to do is incentivize them. And data matters also. We'll get into that in Q&A if we have time. But for now, the three buckets of solutions that I want to talk about is one natural solution, one traditional solution, and one modern solution. Right? The natural solution is forests, and saving forests and making them more robust is probably one of the best things we can do for India. Now, if any company provided 1 lakh crore of tax or value, they will be the cherished darling of the markets, right? And their CEOs, through speakings, will be treated as gospel. But there is a recent study that came out that said, many of our tiger reserves provide this 1 lakh crore in value. But their management is not feted by papers, and they're not in the news unless something bad happens or it's World Tiger Day or something. And to explain this paradox, they provide a lot of value, but not enough cash to their local communities. Sustainability is important, right? And to get a good zone in one of the top 3 tiger reserves, it requires all the pull of getting a good darshan at Tirupati. But there are tigers in the rest of India also. There are other animals in the rest of India also. And there are local communities in the rest of India who will benefit from the tourist income. So my first request is, let's develop tiger tourism or wildlife tourism in all parts of the country, because that's a very rich source of cash flow. The second thing is, if you keep cash flow and jobs in front and center of the policy making, showcase local art. India has fabulous art. Bastar, Bill, Gond art. You can say it, you've got it, and the tourists are there. I recently saw a Gen Z survey. They want to spend. Please give them, this ability to buy. Yeah. Between safaris, there's time. You can do craft classes, wellness retreats. The Japanese talk of Shinrin Yoko, the health benefits of forest bathing. There's all of that. But we need to do that. Look, if we can take a page from the Americans, in 2018, America's national park system welcomed 318 million visitors who spent $20 billion in communities within 100 kilometers of a park. This spending supported 329,000 jobs. This is something we should really copy, right? The second solution, the traditional solution, is our tanks. Look, we've just completed the national water body census. That's a great first step. But how do we get the community to reconnect? How do we create the cash flow and jobs? So what my institute did, and Amit's institute is also weighed in on this, is these tanks can be reimagined as tourist hotspots, right? So we studied, this tank is called Mariamman Teppakulam in Madurai. And, earlier it didn't have water. And once it got water, earlier when it didn't have water, it supported 0 jobs. Today it has 100 plus jobs. Because if you give it the kind of infrastructure it needs, not very big, walking tracks, selfie spots, a cycling path, the food stalls come up, a park, boating facilities. When we did this study, we found that if you do this for a good number of the tanks across the country in cities, you could create tens to hundreds to thousands of jobs, right? That's in cities. But what can we do? And once the community becomes vested in the tank's well-being, they'll come forward to ask when there is encroachment or, waste being dumped, etc. And that keeps the tank healthy, and the tank builds up climate resilience. But this is within cities. What can we do in rural areas? And here I'm going to talk about what Amit's organization did. They've come up with a model where they provide catalytic funding, and then farmers cart away the silt and they pay for the transport of the silt. And Amit, please correct me if I'm wrong. And they've done this. They found this model is very scalable, and they've done this over 6,517 tanks and built water security for more than 1 crore of people, right? And this desilting of tanks increases it improves water recharge. It improves the net income, it improves access to livestock. Many of the things that our ancestors did, we're doing again. So there are scalable examples available today for you to implement. Now, let me go end with the modern solution. Right? And the picture is the sewage treatment plant in my factory. And in my book, I call sewage treatment the Brahmastra in our back pocket. So by now, India's water varies across geography. It is temporally skewed. It's seasonal. It varies across years. But because we go to the bathroom every day, this is a source of water that is available at your doorstep, and it doesn't vary at all. So if you treat and reuse sewage as we did, and this particular technology is fabulous because it involves very little maintenance, it is the Brahmastra, right? Again, my request is don't implement it everywhere, and please, this is not suitable for a centralized sewage treatment, which has been our primary method till now, because you're spending energy and money to pump it to a centralized treatment facility, and then you're spending energy and money to take it back. Instead, make it decentralized. Let organizations treat and reuse some of their storage. Doesn't work everywhere. Doesn't need to work everywhere. If you do it in dry geographies, right, and you tell people in the peripheries of cities and dry geographies, why don't you try this out? They'll be quite happy to, because they're already paying between about 20 paisa per liter of water for tanker water. So spending 5 to 10 paisa in sewage treatment, they'll jump at the offer. So these three technologies have a real potential to make India far more climate resilient. But look, that's aspiring too low. Climate resilience is like the basic. It's like a sponge cake. But the icing is really the jobs. Look, if we take a lot of the adaptation, and I didn't have time, so I didn't go through, crop storage, many of the things you can do in agriculture, etc. You can create 2 to 3 million jobs, and climate resilience and jobs is a future worth, I think, having, and it's not very difficult to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mridula. It's always fascinating to hear you. Many scientists, particularly in the area of climate, just scare us. And this is a scary topic. And I think many of us, we really deserve to be shaken up and woken up from the slumber that we find ourselves in on this topic. But what I really love hearing you every time is that you have very concrete examples, often drawing both from history and from technology to very different areas of the spectrum on what we can really do to address this crisis, which is probably going to be the mother of crisis, for our generation. We have about 13 minutes left before we end this webinar, and we have a lot of questions. And so I'm going to take time to tee up some of them. One of the key questions that comes to mind is, what can each one of us as ordinary citizens, and you talked about the change that farmers used to themselves implement in each of the in the Indus Valley, for example, right? Now I'm assuming that farmers did all of that at that point of time in response to changes in the climate, but at the end of the day, the farmers even then had to sell grains, and so it would have been in response to market forces. Do you think at this point of time farmers would change grains, for example, from wheat and rice, which are water guzzlers and climate inefficient crops, to millets, for example, because of policy, because of climate, or because consumers like us will need to change how we think about climate?
I think that's a great question, and it's a very fair question. So, let's not try and make policy which won't work, right? So I speak of millets and how to shift to millets and change habits in my book. And I think the demand comes first, right? If it's the cart or the horse, your demand always comes first. The good thing is, in this next generation, millets are becoming hip and fashionable again. So, at the risk of, you need to make sustainability cool. No, I'm a mother of teenagers, right? Conscience doesn't get you very far. People will never do something because they say you should do something. They'll do it because of some benefit. But the good thing is, millets are being very cool, becoming very cool. And I think some of the procurement policy, if it starts moving towards millets, that becomes very interesting. Again, when you start thinking of cash flow and etc., eggs is another thing. Let me go back to an example I gave in the book. When India wanted to improve its consumption of eggs, they did a fabulous campaign in the 80s, saying how you should eat eggs. They did pamphlets, they did cooking shows, they did all of that. That can be, that can help. I'm also going to talk about one startup which worked in Punjab and with rice and sugarcane and all that. They found only if farmers could get a sustainability tag and therefore export rice with a slight premium, they were willing to try that technology, right? So yes, farmers will switch, but only if there is demand. And it's up to us to get the demand up. So what can each person do? Be conscious of what you put on your plate. One of the best ways, one last thing, one of the best ways we can get the water footprint down of rice and wheat or any vegetable is to not waste it, right? We waste so much food. I think food waste in carbon emissions comes right after US and China, if I'm not mistaken, and I could very well be because I don't have the numbers on the top of my head. It's an ocean of water that is going there. So if you can store rice, there is another startup that I talk of who's working in Bihar, who gets the percentage of rice that is lost in storage from 25% to 2%, right? That's all water saved. So don't waste food on your plate, and don't waste food in the supply chain. Those are two ways to reduce the water footprint also.
Got it. And Mridula, just to frame this for the audience, in terms of what we can do to conserve water, I mean, one is simply, look, we got to deal with a water crisis in our own cities, and I'm going to come to that in my next question. But to just deal with conserving water, right? What grains we eat is the first thing that you said, and that's a choice. And there, more water efficient grains is a consumer choice. And your solution to that is, make millets more fashionable. Is probably the best way. It's not, maybe a nudge from policymakers could be something. Could you say a little bit more about sugarcane and the quest for sugar, which is another big, water guzzler?
See, again, sugarcane, it's demand, right, Amit? But there are many ways to grow sugar. I just have data again from this startup and another sugar producer, and the water plummets if you grow it with drip irrigation. And this particular technology comes with drip irrigation with a sensor planted in the field. So the field is telling you when it wants water, right? And I've seen the data there. Look, the icing on this cake is that not that you're using 90% less water than flood irrigation to grow sugar, but that the yield is going up.
Yes.
So there you go. This is something that can be sold to farmers, right? Because it's not just that the water consumption is going down, but the yield is going up. So, yeah, I'll stop.
Got it. So some of these solutions, my understanding, Mridula, is, because water has not been priced properly, farmers have not necessarily adapted. But the opportunity to sell them to farmers is not as a water solution, but as, something that they need to adopt because it improves their bottom line. And from a consumer perspective, the choice of what kind of, crops we put on our plate and how we consume them is what's going to ultimately lead to a more holistic way of looking at the planet.
No, but there have been states, Gujarat has been one, where they've gone ahead and said, look, and Madhya Pradesh also, if I'm not mistaken, who have gone ahead and said, we'll price water. And they've done it, interestingly, sometimes it's a flat price for the bore well, sometimes they've got a metered price. And there is a study that I talk of the book. When you do the metered price, with millet growth, if I'm not mistaken, the water consumption goes down and the overall output goes up. There are multiple studies I've talked of in my book. It is possible. And, you just need one or two districts to bite, right? And the moment one district bites, you take a politically safe spot, experiment there. Because the moment you say, I can see, then the farmer says, I will also see. Talking about sugar, WWF worked with the Krishi Vigyan Kendra in UP, and they worked with farmers to save water from sugarcane. So much so that they brought a small river back to life, right? So there are examples aplenty. I think we just need to get them to scale.
Got it. Mridula, maybe we have room for one or two more questions. I want to talk about one urban example, and you touched upon urban tanks. I want to talk upon a more micro solution, which is rainwater harvesting, something I've seen you do in your house. I know that there are rules in many cities for rainwater harvesting. I've seen local solutions in Rajasthan, which are tankas, and people implement them really well. Despite regulations existing in many places, this is not something which, has really caught on. I've seen Chennai is probably one of the best examples where compliance is probably the highest, though not optimal. Um, what will it take in your mind for rainwater harvesting to really get to its full potential? And do you think it's a large part of this urban water crisis solution?
Great question. So my institute actually, Tamil Nadu was a forerunner of this. But when we studied the 2000 people, nearly half of the rainwater harvesting structures hadn't worked, right? They were not working. So I think education is a big role. I think a lot of people, it's sort of a almost automatic response. It's the government's responsibility. But hey, water is variable. You solve your water. Like I'll tell you what we did at home. Compost. Our garden is full of compost that acts as a beautiful rain clutcher. The second thing is when during we repaired our rainwater harvesting, but during the intense rainfall, we saw our rainwater flowing into the street. So we said, look, because we paid a fortune, we put little grills in the pathway, and then we connected it to a structure. I think the unfortunate truth is, Amit, I think market forces will work. More and more people are beginning to buy water, okay, because we are going through this reality of flood and drought, flood and drought, flood and drought. Sooner or later, people will do it, primarily because they're paying a fortune in tanker water. And there's a case study I've used in Maharashtra. I think the payback in rainwater is a matter of months, not years.
So you think rainwater harvesting is going to be a big solution? And from what I understand, just given the extent of rain most of our big cities get, if we actually did rainwater harvesting to its optimal extent, it would actually carry us forward for at least a couple of months into summer. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, let's just, tanks are basically sophisticated rainwater harvesting structures, right?
Right.
And when you add local rainwater at the household level, you add compost, which is also rainwater harvesting, all of that, it just increases. So if you just take tanks and sewage treatment, I think this water crisis is largely sorted.
Great. I think that's probably a good high note to end on, that despite this climate crisis, the solutioning is actually in our hands.
It is absolutely.
Both in the rural area and in urban areas. Thank you so much, Mridula. You've been fabulous as always with your insights, both into the source of the problem and in terms of how, whether it's policymakers or we as consumers, can deal with it. It's been terrific. Great start to the day to hear you. Thank you as always.
Thank you, Amit, for the kindness and for the amazing work that your organization does.
No, and thank you for the great work that you do.
Thank you. Thank you guys for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.